Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the RAF Bomber Command podcast with me, James Jefferies, and my co-host, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. How are you, Jane? How was Norway?
I'm very well, thank you. And Norway was absolutely fabulous as usual. It was very cold, but very sunny, and yeah, absolutely perfect. Made a fantastic trip to the Norwegian Air Force Museum, which is just outside
Brilliant.
Airport in Oslo. Not been there before, but they've got a really fantastic collection. Some really unusual aircraft as well. So they've got like the usual Cold War stuff as well. Obviously, a lot of Second World War stuff. But they had, in particular, a Northrop Nomad, which I'd never seen before, but which was used in sort of reconnaissance and sort of bit of air sea rescue stuff, I think, but it flew mainly out of Iceland, following American British operations there, yeah, but operated mainly by Norwegians, which is really, really interesting. And they had a Ju-52, a Heinkel, a Dornier that had been fished out of a fjord somewhere, and they had a fantastic display about the hundreds and hundreds of Norwegians who went over to Canada for aircrew training, and they sort of all congregated in a place which was nicknamed Little Norway, or Lille Norge if you are Norwegian. And it was interesting account of Norway basically set up in the Canadian countryside, I think it was in Ontario. So that was interesting too. So yeah, it was a really, really lovely trip. Very short, but very sweet. And sadly back to reality this week and to work. But how about you? You okay?
Yeah, it was good. I went to the Scramble event, which was the early access to the game, and we got to see some of the gameplay and such like, and you could have a go on it. And that was really exciting. Met Paul Beaver for the first time. Very, very interesting. And we were just like, did a round table with myself and a couple of other people, and yeah, it was good fun. That was at the Royal Aeronautical Society, but it was great. Sort of, I know I've got early access. They gave us a download code, and I've played a little bit of it, and it is very good. I really did enjoy it. Yeah, excellent. But yeah, so today's episode, men from dozens and dozens of countries around the world served with RAF Bomber Command. Today, we are delighted to welcome historian John Concagh onto the show to discuss the African and Caribbean men who served both as aircrew and ground crew and the Black RAF experience in general. John has appeared on numerous podcasts and also spoke at We Have Ways Fest in 2023. Welcome, John. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. It's a pleasure. It's always a delight to talk about this topic.
So in May, I have to tell you that I actually met a couple of Bomber Command veterans who'd come over from the West Indies in the later stages of the war. And that was the conference at the International Bomber Command Centre down in Lincoln about fighting the air war. They were an absolute joy. They were hilarious. They were such lovely, lovely guys, and they kept us royally entertained all evening. And that sort of led me on to thinking about obviously, their experiences and what have you, and the many, many other men who also made that journey. And this question which arose in my mind was, why would a well-off, educated, young West Indian man living halfway across the world sign up to do an incredibly dangerous job for an empire that most of them wanted to be sort of free of? And why in particular would he choose the RAF above, the other services?
It's a tough question. I think when you grow up in England, you have this idea of, Britain alone, against, this tiny country, against fascism, especially during the Battle of Britain. And then, especially even once the Americans come in, it's still Britain seems very small compared to both Americans and the German society. But of course, we know Britain is part of this huge empire of people who themselves also have a stake in this conflict. And it's a very complicated stake for people from British Africa, British Caribbean, those that are talking about places in Africa like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, modern-day Ghana, known as the Gold Coast then, Gabon, and in the Caribbean, talking the famous islands of the Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, as well as British Guyana. And these are places which have been paying a lot of attention to what's happened in Europe, and a lot for various different reasons. I mean, the first one being, if things happen in Europe have massive effects on what's happened in the Caribbean because of the nature of the British Empire, but also these are societies that after the First World War, after the Treaty of Versailles, are increasingly thinking about their own future and governing themselves. And they watch fascism emerge, and they realize that is an ideology that will hurt them as much as British imperialism will. And a big point for a lot of people like Ulric Cross, who we'll talk about later, who was a student at the time, a big moment was when the Italians invaded Abyssinia. Famously, the British and French do very little to stop the Italian invasion. In fact, attempt to do a deal to pay them off with part of the country. And that's really mobilizing for a lot of educated Africans, educated Black Caribbean people, because this is the last free Black country. And the European powers have sold them down the river. So there is an inbuilt knowledge that I think isn't really matched in many parts of Britain, that fascism will come for us, that it's dangerous. Ulric Cross said in his memoirs and many speeches he gave that he saw the world as drowning in fascism and that people had to do something about it. But they also don't, this is not that people were very happy to immediately sign up from other countries. Britain has a very messy relationship with its Caribbean colonies, with African colonies. 2 years before the war, there had been unrest and risings and rebellions in the Caribbean that had been put down by the Navy. So for many people in the Caribbean, the idea of fighting for Britain for a second time in 20 years, it's another man's war, especially amongst the intellectual class. It's a white man's war. Things changed, though, both in Britain and in the Caribbean after the fall of France, which, as you know, as most listeners will know, everything changes because of the fall of France. But in the Caribbean, it's something. This goes from a war very far away to a war that could come here any moment. There are German U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean. With the Vichy France, there are Nazi sympathizing governments within 1 day sailing. But also for the British, there's no more time to quibble around with color bars and trying to maintain the purity of a force. So, the army has after a campaign by civil rights organizations, dropped its color bar on paper, but they're still not really pushing for it. Whereas the RAF has now looking, as you know, a massive expansion of its manpower. And there's sort of the memorandums from May and June that basically, let's just stop putting barriers. I mean, if people are willing to come to us, we'll take them. There's a specific memorandum in June where the Air Ministry says we no longer want colonial administrations to reject volunteers, which matters because for years, about 5 years, I've seen at least 5 years before the war, you get Black Africans and Black West Indians who volunteer for the RAF, which usually involves at this point paying their way to London to come to a recruiting office or a hearing and being turned away based on the color of their skin alone. And the memorandums are very interesting because they say there's one incident where a guy comes from Jamaica and the board doesn't realize he's not white till he walks into the room. So they have to do the hearing. And then afterwards, we need to find a reason to say no to him. And it's really difficult because he has all the qualifications and he's actually got a pilot's license.
Gosh.
So they end up basically saying, well, we can't take you because you're not. They have to admit it to him and then tell him, well, but we might take you for a ground positioning. And then there's this contrivance. And the RAF is much better about it than the army because there's a couple of instances where the RAF can't get around it. They do let non-white personnel in before the ban drops. There's a case with there's an 18-year-old who is rejected, and I think his former teacher writes to Stafford Cripps, and Cripps brings it up in Parliament, and the RAF doesn't want to have a scuffle, so they just accept it. But that's not a way to create. That's not a way to run an air force. I think by about May or June 1940, once it's clear that, either, like it or not, there is going to be a larger RAF and it's going to be a larger bomber command, they're going to be taking these in. And, I think one of the most famous of the Caribbean bombermen, a Jamaican guy called Billy Strachan, actually makes his way to England in March, having sold to his treasured possessions a bicycle and a saxophone to afford his passage. And him and his friend get to the Air Ministry and they tell the corporal on the door they want to join the Air Force, and he tells them to piss off. So they start a fight with him until an officer inside comes out and goes, no, you need to go around the corner and join over there. And they do. And Strachan is probably the first non-white person to join the RAF, having come from abroad in March. The big contingents come in September. So at the height of the Battle of Britain, this is a time when Jamaica, of course, is the first of the Spitfire funds. There are other funds being developed in Jamaica, they're sending things like women's nappy vans, and there's ships of aluminium. But they also, a lot of the upper middle classes of the islands, the white classes, want to sponsor groups of young men who want to go because they can't afford their own way. And these sponsor groups aren't separated by color. They tend to include huge numbers of the island's intellectual elites, teachers, lawyers, civil servants, people who work in the postal service, doctors are joining in these groups. So Ulric Cross, we mentioned, was the son of teachers. As a boy, he'd schooled flying officer Ulric Cross DFC in his textbook. And he joined up in September. And the September groups tend to go straight to England. And the later groups often go through the Canadian Air Trading Scheme. But what's common amongst all of them is this isn't really adventure. There's not a lot of, they love flying, but a lot of them just want to fight fascism. They're very determined about it in one way or another. So Dudley Thompson, who was a Jamaican, he's a diplomat after the war, said that he found himself, his line is he found himself in a dentist office in Kingston, and he waited his turn, trying to distract himself from his toothache. He saw a magazine which had excerpts from Mein Kampf in it. And as he read it, he discovered, the German leaders' views on Negroes, and he was so gripped by a sudden anger to fly to Germany and teach him a lesson in civility that he walked out the dentist office and asked how to figure out how to sign up. But it's for some of these guys, it's not very popular. I think Owen Sylvester described when he told his father he was signing up. His father went, "Why would you sign up for the white men?"
Yeah,
because it was different, and these weren't guys who were particularly patriotic. Ulric Cross was a member of a group of socialist thinker. He knew people like Alf Mendes, who was the director Sam Mendes' grandfather, who fought in the First World War. But they knew what they were doing. They knew that for many of them, especially in the Caribbean, the price of failure in this war for Britain would be catastrophic for the empire. And they were often going against colonial governments that didn't want them to come either, especially in Africa as opposed to the Caribbean. In Africa, the colonial government, the air ministry, basically asked for about 1,500 recruits. And the colonial administrations do their best to ensure that as little go. An obvious point being they are still using the pre-war fitness tests and pre-war intelligence tests, even though domestically they've lowered the boundaries. And, they're requiring, in Nigeria, you have to have had no malaria infection within, I think it's 50 months. There's a lot to ask of a country which is, rife with malaria. But people do come through. Claude Foster Jones of Freetown was rejected in Sierra Leone, then made his way to Nigeria, signed onto a boat as a stoker, made his way to England, and then went to the colonial office to complain to the minister that he had been rejected. Gosh. Before then going and joining the RAF. Yeah, there's a lot of enterprising people who really don't care that the system doesn't want them to do this, and that comes through into the training, into their experience as crewmen, into their experience as aircrew leaders, as eventually some as squadron leaders, and afterwards is that they're not going to be stopped by a system that is very apprehensive about having them there.
John, was there sort of an initial flood of people coming over, or was it steady trickle, or did it increase, took steadily throughout the course of the war? What are we talking about in terms of numbers here?
We're talking at max, in terms of RAF, I think roughly most estimates peak out between about 7,000 and 10,000.
Gosh,
it's difficult to estimate because that number includes people who think there's not really a tight breakdown for the RAF alone. That includes people who may have come over to serve in logging, in the army, in the navy. In terms of RAF, there's a direct. We know about 3,500 people recruited as ground crew and air crew, organized volunteering from 1943 to the end of 1944. In terms of this wave of these high-determined volunteers, it's under 1,000. The 10,000 number is because simply the British government doesn't keep track. They don't really know. People are making their own way here. They're not counting them sometimes.
Right.
And they're not counting people who, and they tend to count they tend to be looking for the number as part of colonial office figures on race relations as opposed to RAF numbers. So weirdly, I can tell you how many are in Transport Command, which is 85, because after the end of the war, they moved them all out of Transport Command because they don't want them to be flying around the world where they might get into arguments with South Africans and Americans.
Gosh.
So
Of course.
it's weird. One odd part of the research is the numbers tend to turn up when the colonial officer's angry about people being treated badly, and very rarely when the RAF does it themselves, because the RAF itself doesn't really care where they're coming from. It's just, please get in the play.
Yeah.
But it's a high proportion. I mean, especially in the Caribbean, in June from 1940, 41, 42, there is a lot of motivation. There are protests in Trinidad and Jamaica because they want army regiments. Churchill wants the War Office to raise a regiment, and they refuse. A lot of the reason the RAF can expand so much and recruit, especially from 43 onwards, is that the War Office isn't doing it. The War Office doesn't want to raise an army unit. But the RAF is perfectly happy to take 3,000 men as ground and aircrew.
Quite a few coming from, well, as we mentioned at the outset, all over the world. I know that I've looked at a couple of 10 squadron crews who had men from India and Ceylon, as it then was as well. So there's a real mixture of people from literally all over the world, all sort of converging, and within the RAF in particular, I would say, more so than perhaps the other forces. This is obviously reflective of that. Can you tell us some stories about sort of particular experiences of a couple of people who made that journey, sort of how their war actually panned out, how their careers panned out, but also how they were treated and how their careers or career paths developed after the war as well?
So I think one of the most famous, really, Caribbean airmen is Ulric Cross, who we've mentioned a couple of times. And Ulric Cross is famous because he's Pathfinder, and he was a very good Pathfinder. He flew 50 missions, end of the war as squadron leader of, I think it's 139 squadrons. And he was considered one of the best, basically from the go. And if you go on YouTube, there's an interview he gives to Trinidadian military college, and you watch him, and he is as slick as any stereotypical RAF officer you can. And you look at his career, and it's easy to see why. He was a middle class boy, should have aiming to go in civil service, interrupts at life during the RAF. He arrives in England with a friend, and a lot of the recruiting sergeants don't know what to do with him in training. So they tell the sergeants that Cross's friend is an African prince and Cross is his aide, so they have to be treated with respect. And they come back from mess one day to say the sergeant's making their beds. So there's a lot of, as much as there is the obvious racism of children asking about their tails and people asking whether they lived in trees, there's a lot of people of them being able to take it and throw it back in equal measure. And they, Cross, like others, face a lot of being underestimated through the training, and people discover, obviously, that these people are determined, that they know their stuff. Cross famously described how last day of training, they had a full training unit run, which he won. And the next day, he's called into the CO's office, and the CO sort of looks at him and goes, "Do you play cricket, Cross?" And he goes, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "Do you know Leary Constantine?" And Constantine's probably one of the famous Caribbean cricketer of his time. And Cross did know him because the Caribbean is actually only about this big. So he did. And he went, "Yes, I did." And the CEO went, "Oh, very good." And then the next day he discovered he'd been gazetted as an officer, which is a sort of weird. I think it's unclear whether Cross was promoted because he was good or because he knew Louis Constantine. And I think that no matter what it was a well-deserved promotion because he was an unbelievably good navigator with the Pathfinders, so that many of the navigating of the pilots in the squadron would vie to ensure that Cross was their navigator because he'd get the job done. He was also tended to be for the colonial office a spokesman for black airmen. He famously speaks in the West Indies cooling newsreel, which you can see on YouTube at the IWM. And he is given the opportunity to step out from combat after 30 missions. He refuses, and he keeps flying. And he's an incredible guy because he just occurs that, he ends the war as a squadron leader. And it kind of feels like he wasn't done because he then qualifies as a lawyer and then becomes a sort of roving, what's the best way to put it? A roving jurist in British Africa for the anti-colonial movement. So he is High Commissioner. No, he's a High Judge in 4 different countries between 1956 and the end of the 60s. He is a Chief Justice in 2, and he has his life as High Commissioner for Trinidad and England. And throughout this, his war experience seems to drive him. He's built these connections. He knows people in England. He knows people across Africa. But he's a fervent anti-colonial thinker. He's not sort of British patriot. And I think a lot of his post-war career is built on, turning for the country that he was fighting for and working to end its rule. But he was proud of his time in the Air Force. He later phones him his RAF time. But he sort of, in many senses, Cross got the best of his experience because he was good at his job. People liked him, and he didn't get shot down.
Well, yes, that's
at the other end. It's something you did
together, isn't it?
That's another thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's occurs to me the next person I want to speak about is Cy Grant, who most famous to English listeners. So he's Lieutenant Green in Captain Scarlet, amongst other things. But he joined the RAF in 1941 from British Guiana, and he was shot down over Holland in 1943. Famously, he was found by a Dutch family. He was the only survivor from his plane. And eventually the Dutch handed him over to the Germans, who didn't know what to do with him. So famously, he was hauled out of his prison cell and put in front of a camera for a photo that was titled, "A Member of the RAF of Indeterminate Race." They had no idea where he's from. And the Gestapo interrogators were convinced he was some sort of propaganda thing, that they were putting black airmen in aircraft as some propaganda tool. And they were deeply unconvinced when he said he was a combat officer.
Wow.
But eventually he's sent to Stalag Luft 3 after the Great Escape. And one of his discoveries there is that the commandant, I believe it's the commandant or one of the assistant commandants, had worked in Guyana before the war as an oil man. So he was delighted to meet somebody else who knew the part of the world, which was very odd to Grant. But he was very popular in the camp also because he could paint. So he made a living as painting portraits of wives and girlfriend and as a lookout for the escape committee. And like everyone else, he busied himself in there thinking of what he'd do after the war. And he said of this that as an officer in the RAF, you were among the cream of officers. I met all sorts of people, including writers, school teachers, lecturers, and students. And living for 2 years close together, I learned a great deal and asked a lot of questions. I decided then that I would study law because I wanted to go back to the Caribbean and I wanted to get Britain out of the West Indies. And it's this kind of odd thing where he was stuck in this camp for 2 years with, young, educated British men of experience and vigor like him, and also, as you said, Jane, people from around the world, and they're sitting there and they're all going, "This British Empire thing really isn't great, is it?" Sort of like, he's not being convinced by his own opinion. He's not being convinced by the people around him, and that's something that another airman who shot down, Johnny Smyth, who arrived from Sierra Leone, would say after being shot down over Mannheim, is his time in Stalag Luft 1 also was a time of maturity for him. It was when he figured out what he wanted to do with the rest of his time in the world. But his experience was interesting because he was shot down in a short Sterling, having bailed out of a short Sterling at the height of 6'5", which, as you both know, is an achievement because being 6'5" in a short Sterling is hard enough. Getting out of it quickly, even harder. And so he jumps out the Sterling, parachutes into Germany, breaks his leg, is hiding in a barn, surrounded by German soldiers, and he comes out and he describes that the German soldiers were so shocked they nearly dropped their guns because they didn't expect him to come out of the back. And survived nearly being killed by a mob when he was moved through Mannheim. And then he's sent to Stalag Luft 1 in Pomerania, where as a reasonably senior officer, he's asked to be on the escape committee. And, first offered always first chance on the escape runs. And he always refused because he said, I don't think a 6'5" black man would have gotten very far, which I think he's right. But it speaks to a certain aspect of this interesting of their experience, which is very few people talk about prejudice or bad interaction from their units, from the men in their plane, from their fellow officers, or from, as I said, the people that live aside in camps. It tends to come from people detached from them. There's a phrase I used to talk about it, which is it's very hard to be a bigot in a bomber. It's just not large enough. If you have bigoted views, it's like if you don't like somebody and they're in an aircraft, there's two ways that can end, which is one of you dies or the aircraft is shot down. It doesn't change. And that seems to be the experience of many of these guys, that when they hit barriers, it's not from their colleagues, it's not from their junior personnel, it's from the system, it's from people around them, it's from when you go into London or you're on a shared airbase and people who don't understand you, and it affects their treatment. And that also affects everything all the way up to policy. One reason that almost all the Caribbean aircrew, especially from 42, 43 onwards, end up in Bomber Command is because the War Office has declared that no non-white RAF personnel will be in the Mediterranean because there have been difficulties with American personnel and non-white personnel. This is based on one incident involving one West Indian officer who was provoked in his account by American officers. But the report was written up by a senior officer who didn't like him. The report, and it's Owen Sylvester described that this officer, when they arrived at squadron, the officer walked down the line of new crews and walked up to Sylvester's crew and walks up to the South African navigator and says, "I suppose you're the captain." South African navigator goes, "No, sir, it's Mr. Sylvester." And he sort of looks Sylvester up and down, then turns to his aide and goes, "I know how to deal with these people. I have experience in dealing with them in India."
Good Lord.
Wow.
The issue Sylvester has with that senior officer, which includes basically an incident where Sylvester supposedly turns up for a dance in the wrong uniform and then argues about it. That's what the report says. Sylvester doesn't seem to believe he turned up in the wrong uniform. But either way, that CO's reports are the reason that there are very few non-white plane captains, because that's the only evidence they've got for unit cohesion and non-white plane captains. This one report says, well, we were right to say that they shouldn't be plane captains because this happened. But there's plenty who are plane captains. There's tends less to be in Bomber Command. There's a few in tactical air forces in the Mediterranean who end up as crew captains of Bostons and Marylands. In Bomber Command, there are very few plane captains. They tend to be almost always navigators, which is another aspect of they're all really good because they're doing one of the most technically difficult parts of flying an aircraft. Especially from 1943 onwards, there are very harsh barriers on letting them, even if they're promoted, becoming plane captains. So Cross is never plane captain. Most of these guys will go in and be directed away as far away as possible from pilot training. So Billy Strachan, who I mentioned earlier, is very rare because he didn't have to fight to become a pilot. He went straight in pilot training school, was never passed out, who went straight into flying Wellingtons. But he's very rare because there's this institutional concern around making non-white men give orders to white men, which, if anything, from accounts, is an anxiety of administration and not an anxiety of units. Yeah, the unit doesn't care.
Yeah.
These guys are reliable. They were determined. People like Cross, people wanted to be in the same plane as. And it's just, well, the RAF is stuck in the same sort of bind as the British government, which is they are, for lack of a better, upholding forms of racial hierarchy because that's the system the empire is built on. But you've brought it home, which is the one thing you're not meant to do. And worse than bringing it home, you've also had to deal with the Americans, who brought a completely different system. So a lot of these guys get into a lot of trouble with American airmen sharing bases, encountering each other in bars and clubs. And in those situations, when it comes down to it, men of their unit back them at every step, whether you're talking officers backing them or private soldiers backing their mates. There's an incident at one airbase in Norfolk when American aircrew walk in to see a West Indian sitting amongst other British personnel, and they demand he leaves and they're yelling at him. And the local mistress who's running the tea table walks over and tells the Americans off and orders them out the building and says they're not allowed back in until they apologize, which is a sort of attitude of many RAF personnel. The British government has internal stuff going, that's a conversation that would take more than an hour. But the RAF, at the very least, is very hesitant to try and accept American demands, apart from a wider policy around the Mediterranean. So much so that on one base, a Jamaican called Baron Baker was hauled in to speak for the West Indian Airmen there, to the British base commander and his American colleague. And Baker would say, "We are King George VI soldiers, not Roosevelt's little black boys. We are not foreigners. We are British subjects. This is another country, and you are a Yankee foreigner, and you ain't beating us 1 inch from where we are."
You certainly mentioned some incredible individuals, and one that I know you want to talk about is Errol Barrow. Do you want to say a little bit about him? Yeah.
So Errol Barrow from Barbados. He was a teacher, and supposedly a very good one. He signed up in 1940 as part of a group of 12, 6 of whom were killed during the war, which shows the sort of like incredible, the high casualty rate, even by Bomber Command standards for volunteers volunteers. And Barrow, like others, they go up to train in Canada, training schemes. There's whole prejudice. But Barrow then ends up, again, as a navigator of bombers. And Barrow, I think this sort of tells you about the legacies people have. Barrow ends the war as a navigator with Sholto Douglas, who is, I believe I'm correct, he is one of the chief members of the British occupation forces. And they become very close friends to this situation. When Barrow becomes Prime Minister of Barbados, Sholto Douglas is regularly invited to the island in his capacity as chair of BOAC as official guests. They're family friends.
Wow.
Sholto Douglas, Errol Barrow is Sholto Douglas's son's godfather. These are not unfamiliar contacts. You know, people like Billy Strachan, Strachan is one of the many who go into politics, like Barrow did. Strachan goes into politics in Liverpool. He's massively involved with the Communist Party. And a lot of his networks in the Communist Party are built on the people he knew in the RAF. It's built on post-war connections. And this is true of people like Cross. It's true of people like Grant. Johnny Smyth, who becomes a jurist in Sierra Leone, is able to do so because the RAF is sponsoring a lot of these guys to go to the bar at the University of London. Cross, for example, at the University of London was a member of the university's Imperial Commonwealth Society. And one of his colleagues at the time was Lee Kuan Yew, first Prime Minister of Singapore, because that's the kind of place that people are going into. And they wouldn't come there without the RAF experience. It's very formative for all of them. And for I think there's a huge cohort where I haven't really even started to get service stuff, of the 3,000 who come across in 44, 43, 44, who form sort of part of the last cohorts of RAF entry. And their influence is massive because a lot of those guys are the people who are coming back on the first Windrush wave. If you look at pictures of the Empire Windrush docking, there's huge numbers of guys there in battle dress.
Yes.
In RAF battle dress, often with their swatches on.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have just been demobilized as well. They've gone to Jamaica, seen there's no work, and turned around. The RAF has trained these people to do incredibly technical work. In the case of the officers, this is part of an imperial rationale of creating an international leadership class. You train these guys to be leaders. You are giving them responsibility. You are teaching them to be part of a larger thing. It's difficult to ask them to go home and go back to ordinary lives. As much as it would be difficult to ask Douglas Bader or others to go back to living ordinary lives. And, some do just filter back through. I've met people whose they didn't realize their parents or grandparents were RAF servicemen till they died. But in a place like Trinidad, it's part of the national story. Ulric Cross is one of the sort of founding fathers of the country. Many of Norman Manley's cabinet, first Prime Minister of Jamaica, were RAF men. And it sort of becomes part of the national story there as much as it is here.
Gosh, that's absolutely incredible. Yeah, I'm just overwhelmed at the careers that so many of these men went on to have afterwards. It's just, but then if they're coming from that the political classes anyway, then I guess that career path is something which many of them would have pursued in any event, regardless of their RAF service, which kind of almost got in the way, if you like. But from what you said, it also created many opportunities, and particularly for networking, etc. as well.
I think the networking matters, not just in terms of not being in a very small island, but meeting different people, getting to understand international worldviews, and also think internationally about the future, the world, the future they want to create. So W. Thompson, who I'd mentioned, he's a mediator between RAF veterans and the Jamaican authorities after the mutiny on a boat in Kingston Harbour. And Cross had worked for Colonial Office and Veterans Relations as well. Cross and Johnny Smyth are part of the commission that essentially says that the Windrush should be allowed to sail for England. But Thompson, because of his mediation, he thinks, I like this whole thing of mediation. I'm going to go to the bar. So he's a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford.
Gosh.
And and he's a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. And through people he knew in the RAF, he's introduced to practicing law in Kenya and Tanganyika. And he ends up as, for a period, he's Jomo Kenyatta's lawyer.
Good grief. Wow.
Which, not the easiest job in the world. But they all know each other. And the RAF, you're right, these people would have perhaps got into these careers in the Caribbean. But coming from, it's easier to turn around to say no to a Trinidadian coming from Trinidad if you're in English law school. It's much harder to turn away a guy with a DSO and an MC on his chest.
Yeah.
Especially after the war, especially when they, at the time, had RAF backing. But a lot of the influence of these servicemen comes into what happens with British policy after the war in terms of the colour bar, which is as early as August 1944, the War Office is sitting around thinking about whether they will reinstate the colour bar afterwards. It got dropped. It's dropped by the Chamberlain government during the state of national emergency. The Army and the Navy would like to bring it back, and it's the RAF that says no. There is a very colourful memorandum from a Air Ministry representative on this board saying no, which basically, if you strip away all the language that can't be repeated publicly, reads, "I have met."
This, yeah.
I've got to read this. Yeah.
I will send it. It's insane because it basically goes, listen, you think I have met incredibly stupid white people and incredibly clever black people. So the idea that race will have anything to do with the quality of our officers is probably stupid. And then he goes, and besides, we'll get rid of all the crap ones anyway. Which is like, okay. But it is also the memorandum that essentially means that the British government does not reintroduce colour bar afterwards. So there's plenty of these West Indian servicemen, especially the ground crew, who stay on as the RAF transitions into the jet age. There's very, very few of the flying crews do. But some of the earlier trained ground crews are the few people I've encountered who stay in the RAF till 50, 51 as either secondary airmen or ground crews who stay on, until the age of the Victor and the Valiant and the V-bombers. Because this policy has said we're not going to kick you out just in the base of your colour. But it does come from that very 1940s oddness of this is the most racist document I've ever read. But it's an important, I don't think the RAF comes to that conclusion if they hadn't taken the bulk of non-white volunteers, if they hadn't had the experience you discussing, Jane, of being a melting pot for international servicemen from the Empire, from the Commonwealth, volunteers from neutral countries. If the RAF hadn't been the place they come to, I don't think you get them being the veto on that, because it means technically that the Britain desegregates its military 3 years before the United States, which is, I think quite significant.
James, is there any more questions you want to ask? Or
well, there is one I'd like to ask actually, which is where can people learn more about this? Is there a lot out there, or?
Well, there's some really good memoirs and really good accounts. So I would recommend Cy Grant's biography, as I said. His biography is named actually after that quote from the German magazine, "An airman of indeterminable race." That's worth reading. And from Stephen Bourne, I think the recommendations, definitely all of his stuff is really good, but Under Fire and The Motherland Calls go really into depth into experience of Black Brits born in England, Caribbean service and African servicemen. And then also Colin Douglas's new book, The Caribbean and the Second World War, is a very good sort of overall look at what the war meant. And, you know, I might write my own one of these days.
Yeah, go for it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's, you know, and for somebody else has been known to say the Second World War is like an onion. And even this topic of the Caribbean War and this part of the Empire War is an onion. Every day I do research on it, there's another story I want to follow. There's another conundrum. I mean, yesterday I got into this whole thing about the militias, because a lot of the reason that there's lots of strong militias in the Caribbean because there's threats of German submarine raids, but also because of the people want to do something.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much, John. We'll put links to those in the show notes as well, so that people can have a look. And we'll also include a link to John's website as well. Well, that was absolutely fantastic, John. So thank you so much for coming onto the show to share your research and the stories of these men with us too. There's just so much to contemplate there, isn't there? And so many other rabbit holes to be gone down as well.
Definitely.
I certainly think that people will want to explore these issues further. So coming up in our next episode, finally, we talk to author and historian Andy Bird about Coastal Command. I know a lot of you have been eagerly anticipating this discussion in particular. And don't forget, on Sunday, 17th of November, we're holding a live chat and Q&A session, or just general online get-together with our subscribers. It's not too late to sign up. If you'd like to join us and them, you can subscribe for as little as £2.40 or £3 a month, which is probably the price of about, 2.5 bags of crisps? Well, that's chips if you're American, or a packet of Kit Kats. Just click on the link in the show notes, which accompany every episode, or go to nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Subscribers get early access to episodes, as well as invitations to live streams, and help us keep the show going. We love you all. No, honestly, we really, really do.
And as always, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you all again next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.